Hopefully more people will be able to join us online, where many people have indeed registered. My name is John Martins, and I'm the director of the Center for Christian Engagement here at St. Mark's College. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. This is their traditional land, and we're thankful for their welcome to us, that we can be here together. The Center for Christian Engagement is a center at St. Mark's College that emphasizes the importance of listening, reflecting, learning, discussing, and praying as we explore the Christian and Catholic intellectual tradition and seek to learn from others. We're thankful for a number of people who make this work possible. The Cullen family, Mark and Barbara, who support this work through their generous gifts, and to our donors to the center who made this center possible. Peter Bull, Angus Reed, Andy Zox. We're really thankful for their commitment to the life of the colleges and the life of the mind. We're thankful for those of you who are here with us in person, and thankful for those of you who are with us online, and for those of you who are still trying. You'll hear this later, at least when it's on the YouTube channel. Hopefully you can join us. Before introducing the panelists today, I wanted to give you a sense of why I thought this was important and some background on why we're dealing with this topic. It has unfortunately been a perennial topic in the history of Christianity, something we always need to be aware of as Christians in our teaching, preaching, and research. At a recent Jewish and Catholic interfaith dinner, Father Nick Meisel, who teaches here at the colleges, noted the appearance of anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish biblical readings of Jonah in two of the great church fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus and John Chrysostom, dating back to the 4th century. And it's an ecumenical problem found in all branches of Christianity. Some of you are probably aware of one of the most recent examples that took place actually in 1972, where there's a tape of Richard Nixon and Billy Graham talking, in which Billy Graham cites passages from Revelation, referring to the Jewish people as a synagogue of Satan, drawing on passages, as I mentioned, from Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. In a Catholic context, though, these sorts of interpretations are still problematic, if not the same ones voiced by Billy Graham. And one could find centuries of teaching that held that is amongst Catholic teaching that held the Jewish people responsible for Jesus' death, or part of an abandoned covenant and rejected by God, or a religion caught up in dead legalism, as opposed to the freedom of the Christian tradition. Formally, this sort of teaching was rejected at Vatican II, especially in the document Nostra Aetate, and I think we have at least one slide just referring to Nostra Aetate. Those of you who are not aware of it, this was promulgated in 1965, one of the last documents I think promulgated at Vatican II, the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions. This document was passed by a huge majority of bishops at the Council, 2,221 to 88. A part of the document relevant for our panel from a Catholic point of view certainly reads, "Since the spiritual patrimony common to Christians and Jews is thus so great, the Sacred Synod wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect, which is a fruit above all of biblical and theological studies, as well as of fraternal dialogues." It goes on to say, furthermore, in her rejection of every persecution against any man, the Church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. No foundation, therefore, remains for any theory or practice that leads to discrimination between man and man, or people and people, so far as their human dignity and the rights flowing from it are concerned. In many ways, and many Catholics have said this and many Jews have said this document, Nostra Aetate, did not go far enough, but it was an important step forward over 55 years ago, and it rejected the traditional accusation that the Jews killed Christ, that is, were responsible as a people, recognized the legitimacy of Judaism, and condemned anti-Semitism. The Roman Catholic Church has continued to issue documents dealing with these sorts of claims, such as the Pontifical Biblical Commission's 2001 document, The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Christian Bible, which cites now Saint John Paul II, on his 1986 visit to the Great Synagogue in Rome, and was given the stamp of approval during his visit to Israel, in the course of which he addressed Israel's chief rabbi, saying, "We, Jews and Christians, must work together to build a future in which there will be no more anti-Jewish feeling among Christians or any anti-Christian feeling among Jews. We have many things in common. We can do much for the sake of peace, for a more human and more fraternal world." In December 2015, the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews published "The Gifts and the Calling of God Are Irrevocable," which officially and irrevocably rejected supersessionism. Yet today, one can still find in recent New Testament textbooks and popular books on the New Testament subtle and not so subtle anti-Semitic tropes and themes, and these ideas can creep into books intended to train children and adults in the faith. I know this from a Catholic point of view because I continue to serve for an archdiocese in the US as a censor, which I read these textbooks, I read these popular books on the Bible if they want to get an imprimatur from the Archbishop. And one of the things I started to notice was I was constantly correcting these issues, which had already been taught by the Church. And it's essential that as Catholics we continue to do this work, and it's essential, I think, for all Christians to continue to do this work. As the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable states in paragraph 47, another important goal of Jewish-Catholic dialogue consists in jointly combating all manifestations of racial discrimination against Jews and all forms of anti-Semitism, which have certainly not been eradicated and reemerge in different ways in various contexts. History teaches us where even the slightest perceptible forms of anti-Semitism can lead. The human tragedy of the Shoah, in which 2/3 of European Jewry were annihilated. Pope Francis has repeatedly stressed that a Christian cannot be an anti-Semite, especially because of the Jewish roots of Christianity. And so this is important work for us all to continue to do. And it can be easy to take in a kind of lazy biblical interpretation that makes these easy contrasts between Judaism as a religion of dead legalism and Christianity as this religion of freedom, or to use language that continues to create stereotypes. So as Catholics, as Christians, we need to know how to recognize, respond to, and to speak against biblical interpretation that is anti-Semitic. So before we begin in earnest with our two panelists, who you really want to hear, I just want to establish the format for this evening. I'll introduce each panelist before they speak. So first I'll introduce Rabbi Laura Duhan-Kaplan, who is also Rabbi Dr. Laura Duhan-Kaplan. And then when she's finished speaking, I'll introduce Dr. Thiessen. After he has finished speaking, I'll ask if they have questions for each other or some discussion they want to take part in. And following that, I'll open up questions from the audience. And that will include people who are participating in the webinar. If we don't get to all the questions, I apologize for that. And if there are remaining questions and you'd like to ask them or to discuss them, please get in touch with me via email. I won't put the panelists' emails out there, but I will happily take them myself. Let me talk a little bit about our panelists before we hear from them. And as I said, we'll go one at a time. Rabbi Laura Duhan-Kaplan is Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of Interreligious Studies at Vancouver School of Theology, but she's also Professor Emerita of Philosophy at University of North Carolina at Charlotte and Rabbi Emerita of Shalom Synagogue, Vancouver. She received her Ph.D. at Claremont Graduate University, an MA at Claremont, a Master of Education at Cambridge College, and her BA summa cum laude at Brandeis. She's a scholar of many accomplishments, and I can list only a few of them here tonight. She's received a lot of teaching awards. Most recently, the American Academy of Religion, Katie Geneva Cannon Teaching Award 2022. In terms of publications, both book length, articles and blogs and presentations, there's a lot of excellent material, but I'll only go through a few highlights. And one of them is this book that I just finished reading. I think it's your newest book, Mouth of the Donkey. It's really interesting and fascinating, reimagining biblical animals. I learned a lot about biblical interpretation, but also about locusts, grasshoppers, donkeys, snakes, you name it. It's true, I did. She has a book coming out, Shekinah, Bring Me Home, Kabbalah and the Omer in Real Life. Also, The Infinity Inside, Jewish Spiritual Practice Through a Multi-Faith Lens. She has a number of co-edited books, including with her colleague at Vancouver School of Theology, Harry Maier. When she's not working or exploring spiritual practice, Laura is usually volunteering at a synagogue or interfaith initiative, singing with Shalom Jewish World Music Ensemble, leading prayer services with her husband Charles, laughing with her young adult children, hanging out with her companion animals, walking outdoors, or doing household work. Tonight, she'll focus on misreading the God of the Hebrew Bible as punitive and legalistic, and mostly by offering other ways to see and to read these texts. So welcome, Rabbi Laura.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks so much to St. Mark's, to everyone who supported the event. Thanks to everyone who is here in the room and in the Zoomiverse. I really appreciate you all being here. And it is true, I am an animal nut, but I have brought no companion animals this evening. There are just a few things that I would like to say before speaking specifically about the Bible. And one of them is that we all know how urgent it is, particularly in our time, to resist interreligious negative stereotypes and to reach out across divides to get to know one another. It is increasingly obvious that there are individuals and groups who, at least in their minds, stand to gain a lot by dividing us, whether they want votes, social media clicks, or just to distract us from their own corruption and misdeeds. They will happily use any kind of negative propaganda that is floating around in the atmosphere that they know pulls at our heartstrings, incite us to rage, sometimes at subliminal levels, and divide us from one another. And it's really important for all of us and for the health of our democracy that we do not allow ourselves to be divided in these ways. So I feel that the work that we're doing tonight and much of the work that John has been doing through the Center of Christian Engagement and also the cross biblical scholarship that Matt does speaks very deeply into our time. So I'm very glad for this. One of the reasons why it is so easy to be drawn into stereotypical biblical readings is because we also have get my clock visible. We also have negative stereotypes floating around of people we may or may not know very well. And I'll just address two about the supposed corruption of the Jews of Canada. Many people think that Canadian Jewry is composed of many very wealthy individuals. But if you offer pastoral care or social services in the Jewish community, then you know the percentage of Jews living below the poverty line is exactly the same as the percentage of Canadians living below the poverty line. And I know some people have stereotypes that we are legal geniuses and we have cadres of skilled lawyers at our behest. But interestingly, the percentage of the incarcerated population that is Jewish is exactly the same as the percentage of the Canadian population that is Jewish. So we are very ordinary people, like most other people, and it is very odd for us every once in a while to be reminded that for some other traditions, we are a theological problem. So tonight, I hope we'll just talk about a very, very small slice of things that could be read differently in Hebrew Bible, and then when it's Matt's turn, in New Testament. I will be talking mostly about the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, though I will occasionally dip into Tanakh, the rest of the Hebrew Bible. I'll talk a little bit about misconceptions of the rigid legalism in the Hebrew Bible, and a little bit about misconceptions about the harsh and punitive God of the Old Testament. Laws and legal codes are only a very small part of the Hebrew Bible. When we're talking the 5 books of Moses, there's 5 books, but the significant law codes are concentrated in 2 of those. And most of the rest of the Bible has no legal material whatsoever. Much of the legal material is in the books of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy. And in each book, the legalistic language serves a completely different purpose. The book of Leviticus, which I will make full disclosure, is probably my favorite of the 5 books, and it's probably Matt's favorite of the 5 books. I think we might have talked about this on Twitter. The book of Leviticus, of course, begins with detailed technical information about how the priests and their assistants, the Levites, well, actually the Levites only make a cameo appearance. They're big in the book of Numbers. But the Levites, the priests in Leviticus, how they are going to conduct the offerings at the Mishkan, the traveling wilderness tabernacle, and later we imagine that's how they did it at the temple as well. As the book goes on, it moves out of priestly practices and into practices for social justice across the community. And it phrases all of this in very legalistic ways, as if God is saying, you should do this, and you should do this, and then you will do this, and then you should do that, and then you should do that, and if you don't, here's what happens. But why is Leviticus many people's favorite books? I'll give you my take. As I read it, the aim of the prescriptive language in the book of Leviticus is to articulate a vision of an ideal human community. It's not a perfect ideal. There are definitely some things that I would consider mistakes. For example, there's a death penalty. Women's work is valued at lower wages. Homosexuality is against the law. And there are some other details that make it far from ideal. But it is an attempt at a utopian society. And all those rules about the offerings, they describe the kinds of rituals that bring the community together for daily spiritual worship, for times of joy, for times of grief, how to make spiritual atonement after you have completed the process of restitution for any crimes you committed. There are even specific rituals in Leviticus for responding to egregious sins of corrupt leaders. All of that is woven into those detailed rules about the rituals. How can we use ritual, spirituality, and representatives of God to help us maintain this communal equilibrium? The second half of Leviticus focuses more on rules and guidelines for treating one another with respect in this society, and guidelines around the practice of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year for making sure that income inequality in a society does not get too great. And at the end of the book of Leviticus, the long list of harsh punishments if you do not follow these rules. In Jewish tradition, we understand these as the natural consequences of ignoring the sabbatical and the Jubilee year. If you allow income inequality to run rampant in a society, the society starts to decay from within. Right? People are anxious all the time. And may I point out that we are very much seeing this in North America. People are anxious all the time. They set against one another. Enemies can come in with propaganda and attacks and begin or continue to destroy the social fabric. And it is only after we hit rock bottom that we realize we must come back together again. And in the language of Leviticus, return to God and these laws of holiness. But Leviticus is not all legal material and instructions. It actually has two stories in it. And both of these stories are about how challenging it is for human beings to live within these kinds of guidelines. Leviticus, the author, the editor of Leviticus, very traditional Jews will say it's Moses. Other Jews will say, we know there have been a series of editors throughout history before the text reached the final form that we read today. But whoever put it together is very aware that these stories challenge our ability to live into this kind of spiritual community. The first story is placed right at the end of all of the material describing, thanks. The first story is placed right, no worries. Thank you. Okay, my mother said I used to talk back, but you know, this is... Anyway, the first story is placed right at the end of all the material that explains how to conduct the rituals at the sanctuary and bring people together through ritual. And it's the story of the opening day of the sanctuary, where two of the young priests fail to follow the prescribed rules. A fire breaks out in the sanctuary. The young priests lose their lives. Opening day is an absolute disaster. And they have to start over again. Purify the whole sanctuary so people feel willing to come back in again. The second story takes place right after what we call the Holiness Code, the material that tells us how to treat one another with respect. In this story, two Israelites fight one another. A fight breaks out between two people, and they curse each other. They do not follow the rules that were just set out at all. One curses the other in the name of God. Some say that in the context of Leviticus, that curse was so powerful that it caused the death of their opponent. And the person who cursed receives the death penalty. Another story acknowledging that it is very challenging for us to find our way into this ideal society, but it does not mean we should stop trying. The law codes in Deuteronomy are part of a very different project. Deuteronomy sets out the vision of Israelite people settled in the land. In fact, it was probably written long after they were settled in the land under the leadership of kings. but in the narrative context of the Bible, it's placed as if Moses is telling them what it's going to be like when they live settled under their monarchy. And this monarchy is a theocracy. And there are a lot of rules that tell us what it's going to be like to be living under a king with both political and religious power centralized in their hands. A lot of the laws are the same as the ones we see in Exodus and Leviticus. Some of them are different and, in my opinion, not as good. My opinion, not speaking for the whole tradition. But there's also a great deal of emphasis on vilifying other religious traditions. Of course, the narrator is very clear that these traditions might be all right for other people, but we don't want anyone in our ethnic community to follow them because they are bad, they are not true, they are not the real God. And if you don't like that, you are aligned with the majority of Jewish readers of Deuteronomy. Ideally, we wish we could take all of the soaring universalistic theology and the spiritual poetry from that book and leave the theocratic material behind. But it is there, and I think it is very important to notice your reactions if it makes you uncomfortable. Because John was much more delicate when he talked about the rise of religious traditionalism, but we see very close to us, south of the border, that's like, a 30-minute drive. Very close to us, we see significant portions of the population who would like a theocracy. And Deuteronomy gives you a glimpse of what it might be like. And most readers don't like it. Some do, most don't. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the editors of the Hebrew Bible, probably beginning with the rabbis at the Council of Yavne, or as we say in English, the Council of Jamnia, in the year 90, they wanted to keep a variety of different perspectives on Jewish religious history, different documents representing different perspectives in great Jewish spiritual literature. They wanted to preserve all of that side by side. And they all had books they didn't like. We can see that a little bit from the record we have of their conversations. Deuteronomy also spells out the consequences of living without laws. And again, in Jewish tradition, we read these not literally in the language of the Bible that says, if you break the laws, God is going to swoop down and do something bad, but in the sense of, if we let the rule of law in our society completely decay. I'm not saying we should have rigid, decontextualized applications of the law, but if we let all of that decay, then we bring our own society down from within. This is a beautiful segue into stereotypes of harsh gods of the Old Testament. And by that, I mean harsh images of God of the Old Testament, right? The Hebrew Bible is not a fan of polytheism. Just as long as my accidentally adding the letter S has thrown anybody for a loop. If you want to look for stories about divine harshness in the Hebrew Bible, you can find them. If you want to look for stories of divine love and intimacy with human beings, you can find those too. If you want to look for stories of characters who feel completely alienated from God and can't feel the presence, you can find those too. But if you read carefully, you will see there is no single God of the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible is a collection of stories about people's encounters with God. And there is no one story that delivers to us the essence of God. Instead, there are many stories from the point of view of different people interacting with God. For example, here's one we debate endlessly in synagogue. Well, not endlessly. We debate it beginning in January when we start reading the Exodus story until the end of April when we celebrate the holiday of Passover. And that is God bringing the 10 plagues down upon Egypt, right? You know, I don't like to use the phrase the Bible is clear because I think the Bible is deliberately a kind of ambiguous literature so we can find our way into it in different ways. But the story seems to be clear that by the end of the 10 plagues, Pharaoh is the only person who does not want to free the slaves. And yet all of the Egyptians are punished in the 10 plagues. Why do we see God this way in the story? Because the story of the 10 plagues reflects Pharaoh's point of view. This particular Pharaoh, the only thing that is important to him is his economic and political power. So how does he see any limitation on that, even from a divine being? It's a rival king coming and making war against him. That's what we see in this section. We also see not long after that, after the Israelites build the golden calf because they feel abandoned by Moses, who's up on the mountain for just way too many days, having spiritual communion with God. And, you know, honestly, probably getting a couple of days off after the Exodus because that was a pretty hard leadership project. The people are having a meltdown and they want something tangible to worship, to guide them. And for reasons which are beyond the scope of this evening, Aaron actually builds something for them and they worship the golden calf, and Moses freaks out when he comes down the mountain and he wants all of the ringleaders executed. And, you know, he almost lets God say, yes, I agree with you. Let's get rid of all of them and I'm going to start alone with you. And then something happens and Moses says, you know what, God, actually don't do that. Don't do that. If you're going to do that, write me out of your book. I love that. That's one of the few references we have in the Bible about who might have written this book. Write me out of this book, Moses says. And then Moses has a vision of God. God places, the story goes, God places Moses in a cleft in the rock, and God's back or God's after effects pass by Moses, and someone, the text is deliberately ambiguous whether God is speaking or Moses speaking, calls out, God, God, compassionate, patient, merciful, just, truthful, faithful, etc. This is clearly a story from Moses' point of view. Moses is struggling with anger, and then suddenly he gets a glimpse of what are the consequences when a leader allows his own anger, his own ego to guide him. And he has a vision of new guidance from God, compassion, love, and above all, patience. Do I have more minutes or have I spoken?
You have a few more minutes.
I have a few more minutes. This is just a fun one. A little bit more about the multiplicity of views of God in the Hebrew Bible. I learned this one from the scholar Harold Bloom, and I expanded it just a little bit. But if you look at just the 5 books of Moses, each one of them is a separate work of spiritual literature, though we tend to read them together and even in conversation with one another. And by the way, in the Jewish lectionary, every year we read every bit of the 5 books. The beautiful parts, the scary parts, our favorite parts, our least favorite parts, and we talk about what moves us and what alienates us. And then we do it again the next year. If you just look at those 5 books, each one of them has a very different presentation of God to us. The book of Genesis describes a group of people whose everyday life is pervaded with the divine. They walk out their front door or out of their tent, and they're walking with God. They have a conversation with God like it's nothing. They see God at night in their dreams. God is just everywhere. The book of Exodus, you see a completely, or don't see, a completely different face of God. You see a God who's not so comfortable being out and about in the world, an intimate presence with human beings. There's all this stuff about, you can see my face, you can't see my face. There's all the stuff about the Israelites losing faith in God because they can't see God. And God doesn't manifest regularly until God says, you know what? Have the people build me a special place, and I'm willing to dwell in that place where everyone is just holding it together at their best. Leviticus, we've got a completely different image of God. If anybody's a Star Trek fan, I like to use the analogy of the dilithium crystals. There is an energy that is powering the Israelite camp. You can't see it, but it has to be constantly tended. And when it gets out of whack, everything is wrong. And how do you tend it? You tend it by behaving ethically and by correcting the energy of the community when people behave unethically or are psychologically not at ease. Numbers, we got the warrior God. The book of Numbers, page 1, let us now assemble for the military census. Midway through, we find out there's some document called the Book of the Wars of the Lord that no commentator knows what it is because they've never seen it. Is it Numbers itself? Is it a lost book? Is it a metaphor? Who knows? And then we have Deuteronomy, where sometimes the God is the power that props up the king, and sometimes God is the universal being that is responsible for all creation. And in a way, it doesn't matter how people conceptualize God because there is only one power and we're all aiming at that being. And I won't even go into Ecclesiastes where God is the laws of nature, or the book of Esther where God isn't even there, just something people know about, or the book of Ruth where God is something that a being that people bless and draw strength from, but isn't there as a character. Any vision of God you would like to find, whatever you're primed to see, you might just see that in the Hebrew Bible. And so one of the questions of tonight is, what do you want to see when you read the Hebrew Bible? Do you want to see a work that comes out of a terribly corrupt civilization that is a theological problem and stirs anger in your heart and distracts you from the business of being part of a multicultural and democratic country? Or do you want to be something with so much potential for friendship and grace and love and a shared future? Dare I end by saying, the Bible is an open book. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We will have time for questions later, and folks online as well know that you can type your questions into the Q&A. We have two distinguished guests today, two distinguished panelists. Dr. Matthew Thiessen is an associate professor of religious studies since 2016 at McMaster University. I have a fond place in my heart for McMaster University, where I graduated from. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor from 2012 to 2016 at St. Louis University, a Jesuit school in the United States. I'm honored to have him with us, as Matt is one of the top young biblical scholars, not just in Canada, but in the world, examining and helping us deepen our understanding of the deep historical relationship of Christianity to Judaism, and in his books, placing Jesus and Paul in their proper theological and historical context in Second Temple Judaism. Dr. Thiessen was educated at Duke University, where he did his Ph.D., University of Oxford in Jewish Studies, a master's degree, and at Trinity Western University, which some of you might have heard of, a local school. And I know some friends and teachers are present from there, and Tyndall College at the University of Toronto, where he did a bachelor's degree in biblical studies. He's the author of 3 major monographs, with a 4th, A Jewish Paul the Messiah's Herald to the Gentiles, coming in 2023. His 3 previous books include Jesus and the Forces of Death, the Gospel's portrayal of ritual impurity within first century Judaism. I have a copy of that book here, and Matt will be with us tomorrow speaking on this book directly. His other books, which are also excellent, Paul and the Gentile Problem, published by Oxford University in 2016, Contesting Conversion, Genealogy, Circumcision, and Identity in Ancient Judaism and Christianity, also published by Oxford University Press. He's won numerous academic awards and honors, but one standout is certainly the Lautenschlager Award for Theological Promise, given to his book Contesting Conversion in 2014, an award given to only a few recipients throughout the world annually. Professor Thiessen grew up in the Mennonite Brethren Church, something we share in common, and is now active in the Mennonite Church in Canada. Tonight, he'll focus on Christian stereotypes of the Pharisees and modern usage of that stereotype within inner Christian debates and fights. So, Matt, welcome.
I'm just vain enough to note that John called me young. And now that I'm middle-aged, that means a lot to me. My kids think I'm 80. Thanks, John, for having me, and St. Mark's College for hosting these events. As John noted, I did an MA at Trinity Western, so I lived out here for 2 years. And the day I drove away, it was early June, moved away, I thought, this is a big mistake. How could anybody ever move away from this place? So I look for any opportunity to get back out here, and here I am. So thanks for all of you for coming, and those listening online as well. Reading glasses. In the 1800s, on the North German island of Nordstrand, there was a Lutheran pastor named George Bleier. Bleier was a very pious pastor. He did not approve of alcohol consumption. At the baptismal celebration of one of his, less pious parishioners, people found an ingenious way to drink without offending their strict pastor. Spiking their coffee with rum, and then covering the drink in whipped cream, in the hopes that it would mask the smell of alcohol. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and the pastor's nose smelt the booze on people's breath. In a huff, he loudly condemned the people for being, in his words, Pharisees, before storming off from the event. A new drink was born, and it was called Pharisaier coffee, Pharisee coffee. You can still get it to this day. I've had it. I like my rum and my coffee separate. The name of this coffee springs out of long-standing Christian tropes about the Pharisees, a group within Judaism that came into existence in the 2nd century BCE, we think, were around during the days of Jesus, and then were in some way or other absorbed into later Rabbinic Judaism. We actually don't know a whole lot about their origins and how they sort of disappeared from the record. Interestingly, we have no known writings from the hand of a Pharisee. We have all kinds of ancient Jewish texts. Maybe one of them is from a Pharisee. People have suggested that in the past. But we don't have any known writings from the hand of a Pharisee, apart from one person. Anybody know? Paul. Yeah. Who claims to be one in his letter to the Philippians. Christians today know the Pharisees predominantly through the New Testament, which mentions them almost 100 times. Frequently in the Gospels, interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees appear strained, even heated. The most heated of these exchanges occurs in Matthew 23, where 6 times Jesus exclaims, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees," and he frequently calls them hypocrites. The Greek word hypocrite can mean a number of different things, some neutral and some negative. Of course, we know the negative one, don't we? Neutrally, for instance, the word can mean one who interprets or one who acts, an actor. Based on these neutral meanings, though, and especially based on the meaning of one who acts, a more negative meaning arose, a person who acts like one thing, but who is in reality something quite different. And this is what the word means in English today. Someone who says one thing, but does another. A former high school teacher once told my friend to throw away his cigarette, since it was against the rules to smoke on school property. All right, confession, my friend was me. But smoking is like the biggest sin in my kids' minds, so they can't listen to this recording. In response, I pointed to the pipe dangling from his own lips as he said these words to me. His retort, "Do as I say, not as I do." That's the motto of the hypocrite. Sometimes that's my motto as a parent. And Matthew 23 has led Christians for almost 2,000 years to associate the Pharisees with negative religion. They were hypocrites. One can see this, for instance, in one poll, which was run by the evangelical Christian polling firm, the Barna Group, which contrasts 2 different types of people, or actually characteristics: Christ-likeness to Pharisee-likeness. This oppositional contrast depicts the former, obviously, Christ-likeness, it's a Christian group, as inherently good, and the latter as, well, inherently bad. The survey results use the word hypocritical and self-righteous to describe what it means to be like a Pharisee. There are actually a whole list of descriptions for Christ-likeness, and it's sort of mirror opposite for Pharisee-likeness. And then it goes on to assess different Christian denominations for who's more Pharisee-like and who's more Christ-like. So we know this. We know this use, and I'll get into that here. Given this understanding of who the Pharisees were, is it any wonder that Christians have slung this term around as an insult in our interfaith debates? Martin Luther, for instance, called Roman Catholics hypocrites and Pharisees, something that many Protestants still do to this day. Progressive or liberal Christians call evangelicals Pharisees. Conservative Christians call woke Christians Pharisees. There's a book out there called, just came out last year, Social Justice Pharisees, woke church tactics and how to engage them. In fact, there's even a Christian board game out there named Pharisees, the party game. You can see it on phariseegame.com, but please do not buy it. Where some players are supposed to pretend to be followers of Jesus, and this is really insidious, but must secretly go around stoning Jesus' disciples in the game. The Pharisees in this supposedly family-friendly game are not just hypocrites, but also dangerous, trained and secretive assassins. Think about that message. As a family playing around the dinner table. Scholars have long questioned this simplistic and negative approach to the Pharisees, not to the assassin part. No one's ever thought the Pharisees were assassins until this stupid game. For instance, while not nearly as numerous, we do have neutral or even positive portrayals of the Pharisees in the New Testament. John, the Gospel of John, which has its own difficulties with its portrayal of Judaism and the Jews, has Pharisees who are believers in Jesus, so they're not antithetical. And the Apostle Paul, as I already noted, says that he's a Pharisee, something that the Acts of the Apostles continues to say about Paul. He claims to continue to be a Pharisee. So it's not, again, like there's this opposition between being a follower of Jesus and being a Pharisee, even in the New Testament. And of course, not all the Pharisees are bad, even in these narratives. And all these interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees aren't always negative. We can get into some of that. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells a story about a Pharisee and a tax collector. It goes like this. I'll just read the story. It's pretty short. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying in this way. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And then this is Jesus' conclusion. I tell you, this man, that is the tax collector, went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. It has been common to use this story to suggest that the Pharisees are known for their spiritual arrogance. But I don't think that's the right conclusion to draw from the story. For sure, this Pharisee is clearly confident in his righteousness, and the tax collector is humbled in his sinfulness. But is the point of the story to condemn the Pharisees as a group? Of course not. It would be just as silly to conclude that Jesus thinks all tax collectors are aware of their sin and humble before Israel's God. Rather, the point is to take a group whose deeds are generally thought to be beyond reproach, the Pharisees, and to provide an example of one member, a made-up member of this group whose attitude displays spiritual arrogance that is off-putting, not humility before God. In my early 20s, a friend of mine became a youth pastor at a rural United Church of Canada congregation. One song he picked up there was entitled, I Just Want to Be a Sheep. Do you know this song? Anybody know this song? I know, okay, I see 2 hands. Who wants to sing it with me? I didn't know the song, which is kind of shocking, given its general cheesiness. This is how one of the verses goes. I don't want to be a Pharisee. I don't want to be a Pharisee, because they're not fair, you see. I don't want to be a Pharisee. A cute little rhyme. But the message is, to be a Pharisee is inherently bad. They're inherently unfair. Again, a children's song. And there's a verse about the Sadducees. And there's a verse about the hypocrites. They're not hip with it. I think that one stands still. They didn't have anything for the Essenes, which is a real bummer. Yeah. This depiction of unfairness is closely connected to the question of hypocrisy and rooted in some of the claims of Matthew 23. But were the Pharisees by nature hypocritical? Were all Pharisees hypocritical? If we can't easily determine the motives of people living today, actually, can we even determine our own motives half the time? How much more difficult is it, or how fair is it, for us to determine the motives of people living 2,000 years ago? Is it fair of us to describe, speaking of, I don't want to be unfair, is it fair of us to describe and condemn the Pharisees as inherently hypocritical? Surely many Pharisees were probably very devoted to seeking to interpret and live God's laws in ways that they believed were pleasing to God. And presumably there were some Pharisees whose motives were more complicated, or who taught one thing even as they didn't live it out. Who of us doesn't? I condemn Amazon very frequently. I shop there a little less frequently than I condemn it. Surely the motives in hearts of ancient Pharisees were as diverse and complicated as the motives in hearts of Catholics and Protestants and any other group today, including Mennonites. But to use such individuals or such behavior as somehow definitive, something about the essence of that group, is deeply unfair and I think inaccurate, historically inaccurate. Christian tropes about Pharisees also suggest that they were too strict, too bound to laws, too harsh in their religious sensibilities, too legalistic. Often one hears such claims deployed by more liberal or more progressive Christians against conservatives or fundamentalists. They are being, so the saying goes, Pharisaical because of their various modern moral views. And in Protestant circles, this thinking has often been deployed against Roman Catholicism for not purportedly emphasizing God's grace sufficiently, or at least sufficiently to Protestant sympathies. What is fascinating about this depiction of the Pharisees is that it seems to get them almost exactly wrong based on what a good number of scholars of the Pharisees and of ancient Judaism note. When one compares the different legal positions of ancient Jewish groups to each other, one often comes away with the impression that the Pharisees were actually more lenient than other groups. If you compare the Pharisees to the Essenes, for instance, something scholars of ancient Judaism do, Pharisees come off as more lenient, more flexible, seeking to make the law work in different situations. They weren't seeking to make people's lives harder, but seeking to interpret the law in ways that made it something livable for people in ever-changing circumstances. And interestingly, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus doesn't accuse the Pharisees of being too pious or too righteous, but actually in his mind, not righteous enough. In fact, and I think this bears saying, that if we want to talk about strictness when it comes to interpreting the law, Christians need look no further than the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, a really dense legal section. There, in what interpreters have long called the Matthean antitheses, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, well, right after the Beatitudes, Jesus repeats the formula, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And each time, arguably, Jesus takes a law from the Pentateuch and intensifies it. You think it's good enough not to murder? Nope. Don't even get angry. You have heard it said not to commit adultery? Nope. Don't even lust. Oh, and also don't get divorced. You hear don't swear falsely? No, just don't swear at all. Jesus is actually making it harder, not easier. If Christians want to condemn the Pharisees or anyone for being too strict, then they also need to condemn Jesus for being even stricter. So maybe the issue isn't actually strictness or perceived strictness. So what are we to do with the critical rhetoric and stories that we find in the New Testament? After all, for Christians, the New Testament is scripture, something read privately and corporately. Stories of the Pharisees appear often in lectionaries in various religious contexts. One approach to handling the Gospel's rhetoric about the Pharisees is to stress, and I think rightly, that the Pharisees were just one Jewish group and can't simply be equated with all ancient Jews. Whatever Jesus' criticisms of the Pharisees, we can't say that he was criticizing or condemning or rejecting Judaism. This is absolutely true as far as it goes. We know about other Jewish groups that existed in Jesus' day: the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, followers of John the Baptist, followers of Jesus. For that matter, we also know that the vast majority of ancient Jews weren't card-carrying members of any particular group. Historical knowledge can and should help Christians today, in that we have a much greater understanding of the diversity of ancient Jewish beliefs and practices. Just as I hope no one here would make the mistake of thinking that all Christians believe and do exactly the same things, so we shouldn't make that mistake about ancient, or for that matter, modern Jews. Whatever criticisms are leveled at various Pharisees in the Gospels, shouldn't be extended to apply to all ancient Jews. But even more, those same criticisms surely didn't apply to all ancient Pharisees. Building on this observation, it's important to remember that Jesus and his followers were likely closest in their thinking and behavior to the Pharisees. They held to the same sorts of scriptures. They believed in the same God. They both believed in the resurrection of the dead. The legal arguments that Jesus deploys often look similar in style and logic and argumentation to the types of legal arguments that we see from the Pharisees and later rabbis. They shared more in common than they disagreed over. But what they disagreed over took on greater importance and led to heated rhetoric. How exactly does one keep the Sabbath? For instance, we keep the Sabbath, but how? It's also important to remember that Jesus' circumcision of the Pharisees occurred in a very different context than modern negative uses of the term Pharisees. Here I think there's some sort of theological alchemy that happens, negative alchemy. Jesus lived and taught in a region that it was almost exclusively Jewish. His discussions, his debates, and disagreements were with his fellow Jews. And just like inter-Catholic or more broadly inter-Christian debates can at times get heated, so too could ancient inter-Jewish debates. The Pharisees and the Sadducees disagreed with each other, as they both did with the Essenes. All were seeking to live out their lives in fidelity to God and God's law. They had competing visions of what it meant to be faithful. And being faithful to God was of such importance that it led to heated disagreements at times, precisely because they cared. But when Christians read these now 2,000-year-old stories of conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, a dangerous possibility arises if we take them out of context and apply them to our own worlds and opponents. A mutation occurs, taking an inner Jewish debate, stripping it of its context, and then turning that ancient rhetoric into what functions as anti-Jewish claims today. Inner Jewish debate to anti-Jewish rhetoric today. But beyond these historical realities, I think there are even more important considerations. Well, it is true that the Pharisees were but one stream of ancient Judaism, and so any criticisms of them are not necessarily criticisms of all ancient Jews or of ancient Judaism. The reality is that many Jews since late antiquity have identified the Pharisees as their spiritual and traditional ancestors. You don't see this as early as the Mishnah, but you start seeing it already in Talmudic literature and then from there. And as Amy Jill Levine, a leading New Testament scholar who is Jewish, puts it, the Pharisees are our spiritual ancestors, those who preserved the interpretations of Israel's scriptures and adapted them for the people apart from the Jerusalem temple. So to hear and perpetuate negative stories of the Pharisees from the Gospels as though they are straightforwardly descriptive and get to the essence of what a Pharisee is to implicitly criticize the roots of contemporary Judaism, and thus of Judaism. Let me be blunt. Many Jews hear Christian rhetoric about the Pharisees, whether the rhetoric already found in the Gospels or rhetoric from our own modern religious and even secularized discourse. Now it's a Christian secularization, but it's secularized, as a claim that to be a Pharisee is to be something inherently bad or negative. And if many Jews consider the Pharisees to be the ancestors of modern Judaism, what they hear, regardless of how we might qualify things or even how we might intend things, is Christians denigrating Jews and Judaism. And if that's the case, to my mind, that should be the only reason Christians today need to stop altogether any pejorative use of the term Pharisees. So I appeal to Christians not to use the term Pharisees pejoratively, neither in serious conversation nor in passing. Those who preach obviously will come across stories of disagreements and debates between Jesus and various Pharisees. Remind your listeners that these debates initially occurred between Jews, and that whatever rhetoric exists, whatever rhetorical heat exists there isn't for us today. As Mary Boyce, a Christian theologian with expertise in ecumenical relations between Jews and Christians, puts it, the New Testament's polemic against Jews, and I would add or stress also Pharisees, should be classified as a rhetorical strategy of the Hellenistic world that doesn't have authority for Christians of our time. Christians all know that Jesus taught people to love their neighbors. In fact, I can think back to 2004. It's a story I often tell my students. 2004, during the American presidential election, George W. Bush and John Kerry, am I remembering this correctly? No. That's going back a long time, almost 20 years now. I remember watching this. I don't know why I was watching it, apart from just that sort of Canadian horror fascination with American politics. And Bush had repeatedly talked about how Jesus was his favorite philosopher. And the moderator asked him, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I take Jesus's command to love your neighbor as yourself as just, really important. And that's what would guide my presidency. And John Kerry, they asked John Kerry too, and as a good Democrat, doesn't talk much about his faith, but he said the exact same thing: love your neighbor. And I was sitting there watching this, and I thought, no, your favorite philosopher isn't Jesus; it's the priestly writer of Leviticus. It comes from Leviticus. Jesus is just quoting. The love commandment is from the book of Leviticus, that book many Christians love to hate. To close, Amy Jill Levine writes, if priests, pastors, and religious educators would stop bearing false witness against Pharisees, if people in general will stop using Pharisee as a synonym for hypocrite, and if Jews and Christians had better knowledge of both our common roots and our distinct branches, we'd be closer to the love of neighbor and love of stranger that both Leviticus and Jesus command. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So before I open it up to questions to the audience, are there any thoughts or comments you have for each other in terms of what you've just heard, or any?
I thought it was a great presentation, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
I think the audience,
Yeah, why don't we do that? And Kevin, you have a microphone, hey, for people who are present, and I'll try to keep track of questions coming in. Someone did know that song, by the way.
I don't know if I'm happy about that or
No.
sad about that. Okay.
So that's not exactly a question, that's more of a comment. Okay. So any questions?
We do have one.
Oh, we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both your presentations, very enlightening. I'm just wondering if, I'm going to, I guess, speak to my own generation, but if historical critical readings, which I've heard both of you echo, doesn't help us sort of save us from the moral dilemma, in the sense that for both testaments, if we take the Deuteronomistic history, presupposes Deuteronomy, presupposes the publication of Deuteronomy, which puts us in the 7th century with Josiah. Were there Canaanites living in 7th century Judah at the time? Were they a particular problem? I think not. But they use the word Canaanite kind of as a cipher for a particular kind of religion, a particular kind of morality. You see that in Deuteronomy, you see that in Leviticus 18 and 20. These behaviors are Canaanite. So in point of fact, it's not really an ethnic struggle, it's kind of a culture war where we use Canaanite as a cipher for certain kind of behaviors, but we're not really teaching people to despise a particular ethnic group. Here in the New Testament, I mean, I speak out of ignorance, but I suspect many of the people in Matthian churches would probably never run into a Pharisee. I don't know, but I'm just thinking, again, you have the same kind of characterization where you use a particular stereotype for a particular characterization of hypocrisy or whatever. So using that historical critical knowledge, we realize that in point of fact, the Bible is not making an anti-ethnic point or an anti-particular religious group such as the Pharisees. That just as you said in respect to the prayers of the tax collector and the Pharisee, it's not teaching anti-Pharisee any more than it's teaching pro-tax collector, but they're teaching a kind of religious and moral behavior that we would find more acceptable than simply singling out an ethnic or religious group. Would that be fair to say that both testaments are engaging in that kind of mode of teaching Torah instruction?
I'm not sure we need the question at the end. That was a great reflection that you offered. I think as to what is the original intent, all of biblical scholarship is trying to recover that. Could it be a code word for distinguishing between different groups within that one ethnic society? Absolutely, absolutely. Especially since, it's obvious, certainly with the Hebrew Bible, that the stories are all retrojected back into a mythical time. And it's sort of that retrojection, I hope I'm using that word correctly, that retrojection assumes that people share a particular mythology of what it was like back then. And highly likely it's not accurate. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, with Matthew, it's a good debate. Again, we have retrojection clearly back, not nearly as far, but from when Matthew's writing back onto Jesus's life. This Matthew, especially Matthew 23, it's nowhere else. It's particularly Matthean. So how historically accurate is it the Pharisees? That's I think, a really good question. There are a number of Matthew scholars who think Matthew's community has actually broken off from the Pharisees even. So there might be really close knowledge. But then the rhetoric is it's charged just because of how close they really are. And the pain of whatever happened for them to break off, which doesn't necessarily make it right or good, but you could see there's more than just that the Pharisees are actually hypocritical, actually all these things. It's just part of the dynamics of human behavior and disagreement. I think when I think about like that, the question regarding the Canaanites, you can just see how dangerous that could potentially become, right? And that's what's to me so frightening. Okay, maybe it's just a cipher, but we all know culture wars are dangerous. We're living them.
Palestinians are the new Canaanites.
Yeah. So, that helps, and yet I also am like, ooh, I just worry about even still the potential. And so I really, really appreciated Laura's comments about what are you going to the Bible for? And I think, at least the Christian tradition I grew up in did not stress the sort of ethical component of reading that I hear you stressing. We make choices in how we read, in what we read, and in what we emphasize. And I think in some Christian circles, there's the Bible told me so, that's why I believe it. And so I could wash my hands of responsibility. And that's just false. We're all responsible for how we read and for what our readings do, make us do, and encourage other people to do. So, yeah, I really appreciated that with your,
Yeah,
I could riff off that if you
yeah,
don't
go
have
ahead.
another question. The problem of turning characters in biblical stories into ciphers is obviously not unique to Christianity. We do this a great deal in Judaism. For example, in classical rabbinic midrash, basically under Rome and Roman Christianity, all the bad guys in the Torah become ciphers for Rome, right? Esau, who is a perfectly lovely person in the Bible, right? He honors his parents. He makes peace with his brother at the first chance he can. He just seems like, a great person. He's in classical rabbinic midrash. He's reread as a symbol for Rome, and all kinds of bad stuff is read into the text about Esau. But what ends up happening in modern Judaism is most people who learn Torah, go through the lectionary at the synagogue, forgetting even the people who don't go to synagogue but consider themselves, still masters of the linguistic religious tradition, whether that's an accurate self-description or not. But even the people who go to synagogue and study the lectionary, they're not literate in the history of rabbinic midrash. They hear the midrash, the midrash is the classical rabbinic interpretation. They hear the midrash, and they think, oh, well, an authority said it. That's clearly what's in the Bible. Esau is a bad person, but their current struggle is not with Roman Christianity. Their current struggle, for many of them, since the state of Israel is so much on their mind, their current struggle is with Palestinian leadership. And they think, oh, that's who Esau is. That's who Ishmael is, right? And the Bible is telling us that these are bad people, when actually the Midrash thinks that they're Rome, and the Bible has no idea of what's happening in modern times and doesn't think that they're either. So it's a fascinating game if you have the knowledge to analyze it. And it's, as Matt said, it's a very dangerous game if you're just caught up in it.
So we do have some online questions, and I'd like to sort of contextualize one of them here about what both of you have been talking about, I think, about careful reading, thoughtful reading of the Bible, being aware of when you're reading. That is, some of this anti-Semitism might be not malicious even, but sloppy, or simply the way things have been said, born out of ignorance. But you have to take responsibility for how you read and how you think. So here's a question from online. The song Lord of the Dance, this is a song I know, was very popular among religious Christians of various denominations back in the 80s and 90s when I used to hang out with a lot of missionary women in Japan. As the only Jewish person in the room, I didn't have the courage to point out the anti-Semitism in it. And I have to admit, until I read the question, I hadn't thought about it. But the way they all sang it so enthusiastically and unquestioningly made me very uncomfortable. I'm wondering if it's still popular now, and if any Christian has questioned it publicly. So she offers a verse from Lord of the Dance. I dance for the scribe and the Pharisee, but they would not dance, and they would not follow me. I danced for the fishermen, for James and John, they came with me, and the dance went on. I'm not sure that I've heard a similar kind of challenge to that. It was very popular. Probably some of you know this song. But yeah, I hadn't, that sort of loose language, scribe and Pharisee in a clearly negative sense, contrasted with the fisherman, is, I think, pretty common, right? And it's something we just have to become aware of and respond to in a thoughtful and careful way. I don't know if the song's still popular. In answer to that, I don't know if anyone else, but it was. Thank you.
Wow.
So thanks for that question. And I don't know if there's any other comment, or if I ate up all the time there.
I'll say something very
Yeah.
quickly. I think that's exactly right. I don't think the people who, or the person who wrote that song, the people who sing that song, I don't know it, are thinking, well, this is anti-Jewish and I love singing this song, right?
Yeah.
They're not. They don't know that how it could be received, how it has been received. And I don't think they're aware of it. You know, I got into a bit of a Twitter spat a couple years ago with someone because they talked about the Pharisees really negatively. And I said, well, you got to stop doing this. And he's like, well, I'm not condemning all Jews, just the Pharisees. All the other Jews might have been great, but the Pharisees were obviously very rotten and bad. And I thought, he was involved in, or at least he thought he was involved in sort of, efforts to teach Christians about anti-Judaism. And he didn't know how maybe using Pharisees as a cipher for all that's sort of bad about religion could itself be anti-Jewish. So I don't think it's intentional necessarily. And I think that's really important, because if you feel you're getting accused of being anti-Semitic intentionally, that's really hard to hear, because no one wants to be, or, well, I shouldn't say nobody wants to be. Unfortunately, some people do. But most of us, if you're here, you probably don't want to be. I think it's unintentional. But if you learn, then you're responsible, I think, once you've heard. So that's what I would say.
Our questioner has added, she said, look at the last verse, it's much worse. I don't know if you can show it, Kevin. The last, I danced on the Sabbath and I cured the lame. The holy people said it was a shame. They whipped and they stripped and they hung me on high and they left me there on a cross to die. That is even more problematic than that first verse, because it makes that common claim that we find throughout Christian history of the Jews as a people being responsible for Jesus' death. Again, this is far more direct, I think, even than that first. I don't know that people intentionally wrote it in that way. Again, who can tell? But it is a real problem. I don't know if it's still sung the way it was. Sometimes, Kevin? Oh, it's still in the hymn books. Okay. So it does, it's a constant challenge, I think, for all of us to respond to this where we see it, where we find it. Official documents from a Roman Catholic perspective are there, but how we respond to them and how we respond to this when we see it is a key issue. And I do think it is a constant task. I'll take one more minute here before seeing if there's any final questions to say, this is what is at the heart of Catholic intellectual tradition of training people in the humanities, training them in the liberal arts, and which we find throughout the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition of training people to read carefully, training people to question what they receive and to challenge it when necessary. It's not always supported right now in our educational environment, but it's essential. It's essential. And you put it in the context, and I wanted to ask you about that, of the political environment in the US in particular, where it seems like this sorts of religious anti-Semitism are being utilized once again in a political context. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that at all, or if you've said what you needed to on that, Laura. But it struck me that it really is being reutilized, these kinds of forms of reading the Bible.
I could say more about that. I don't know if the first thing that comes up is more about forms of reading the Bible. But I think about vilifying Jews by vilifying the Pharisees. And the funny thing is that if you think of Jews as Pharisees, or even as the heirs to the Pharisees, that is pretty much a concept that floats around in Christian thought that is completely unanchored to any Jewish self-understanding. In the entire Talmud, which is volumes and volumes, the Talmud, that great book of Jewish law and lore, right, from late antiquity, there's maybe 2 sentences in the entire Talmud about Pharisees, and nobody is really sure what they mean because we don't have the context of who the group was and how it practiced. There's a couple paragraphs in Josephus, but I mean, who reads Josephus? Graduate students in the history of Judaism and Christianity. So we know vaguely that some people might think the early rabbis were heirs of the Pharisees, but that's all we know. It doesn't have any root in modern Judaism. And there are other anti-Semitic tropes that float around that might be analogous to that. For example, everything liberal is funded by George Soros. Who the heck is George Soros? We don't know who he is. He's not a famous philanthropist of Jewish organizations. His last name sounds kind of Greek. We never hear anything about him except as a right-wing anti-Jewish meme. So when you start to look at some of these tropes, you might ask, what are they anchored in? Right? They're anchored in a mythology that has developed specifically in order to discriminate. And what is scary is, I don't know if people are increasingly losing their ability to discriminate between memes and tropes and actual information, or if we're always like that. But I think, as Matt said, and the whole reason why John has convened this panel is, once we do start learning, what are the effective ways that we can share what we're learning? It might not always be standing up in church and telling the priest they're wrong. Right? It might just be in conversations with friends. It might be the beginnings of new understandings for yourself. It might be in a letter to the editor. It might be in the way you teach your own children. But something, because once you start to see the prejudicial readings, I hope that you will not be able to unsee them and you'll begin to change.
I think, yeah, one final question.
Thank you both for your stimulating lectures. Up until this point, we've discussed mostly sort of unflattering stereotypes and caricatures of the Pharisees and of God in the Hebrew Bible. I'm curious at the level of sort of more popular level stereotypes and caricatures. I'm wondering of your opinions about current scholarship. So at the level of scholarship in Hebrew Bible and also in New Testament studies, are you finding these same caricatures? I'm thinking in New Testament studies, it's been many decades since E.P. Sanders' Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which I understand has been making at least slow inroads in many conversations, or at least in my experience with conversations about the Hebrew Bible, in my case from more of a Christian confessional standpoint. There seems to be a lot of energy to also look into this sort of correct this caricature of some sort of vindictive, one-sided portrayal of Yahweh in the Old Testament. So just thoughts on that. I would be interested to hear.
Yeah, it's so 1977 is when E.P. Sanders wrote Paul and Palestinian Judaism. So 45 years ago. It has made inroads. Has it convinced everybody that Judaism is not this sort of dead, unfeeling religion of works, trying to earn God's approval, and he's some sort of, again, and it fits perfectly with this vindictive, unmerciful, ungracious God of the Old Testament, so supposedly. but it's still, you still see it out there in scholarship in certain circles, I think. And I think it's worth saying that I'm sort of jumping here, but there's also a vindictive God in the New Testament. Those stories exist too. Read the book of Revelation. That's a pretty troubling text, at least parts of it. And so, that God of the hateful, wrathful God of the Old Testament versus the loving, sweet, gentle God of the New Testament, it's complicated both by the loving God of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the vindictive God in the New Testament. So you can find those stories wherever. What stories are you looking for? Yeah. Sorry, I jumped around there.
No, I did want to mention one of the responses, which has been really interesting, and this has only taken place in the last few decades. I'm not sure exactly how far back, but of Jewish New Testament scholars. And this has been a movement, I think, that we've seen with, you mentioned Amy Jill Levine. In Canada, there's Adele Reinhardt's, one of my teachers. There's a number of Jewish New Testament scholars, and we have now the Jewish Annotated New Testament. This is now in its second edition. This is really helpful to assign for students, because each of the books of the New Testament has commentary by a Jewish scholar, and it gives context to Judaism, a lot of what Matt has been doing here, and to the Hebrew Bible, what you have been doing here, Laura, as well this evening, and gives us a real context for the New Testament as a Jewish series of Jewish documents as well, which is really intriguing. And I think it can be a challenge for some Christian students to read, but it's also really helpful, I think, in opening up their eyes to see the New Testament in its historical context and theologically as well, in the context of Second Temple Judaism. There's always work to be done, but I think, movement has been made forward as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say something about that, so I'm really glad that you brought it up, the Jewish Annotated New Testament. It's certainly true that within the American Academy of Religion, which is the big, international academic association for the study of religion for people who are comfortable in English, interreligious studies, multi-faith, multicultural studies are very popular right now. So there is a lot of permission and encouragement for scholars to look with favorable eyes upon other traditions, right? Because when you're an academic, especially a young academic, you want to research and write the things that are, I don't know what the right word is, getting coinage, getting recognition within the discipline at that time, because it's great to be a radical thinker, but you need a job. So right now, this is very much in the ascendance. So there's, again, a lot of permission for the favorable eye. But again, stepping outside of Christians looking at Jews and sort of moving into Jews looking at Christians, the Jewish Annotated New Testament is widely read by Jews now who are interested in learning more about the New Testament. And before this text, I'm not talking about all of history, I'll talk about my adult lifetime when I thought about such things. I first read the New Testament when it was assigned for a university course, but most Jews I knew did not want to read the New Testament, not even the Gospels. They might start out as fun, but as soon as they hit something that made them uncomfortable, they didn't want to read this anymore. They're like, this book is not for me, right? I'm not the target audience for this book. I don't want to read it. But with the scholarship of Amy Jill Levine sort of reaching the generally educated public and her being able to say, frankly, yes, here are all the things about understandings of Jesus that make you uncomfortable. And in spite of all that, I see so much value and beauty in the New Testament. The fact that she can do that gives permission to other Jews to investigate more carefully and to have the commentary of the Jewish annotated New Testament makes it much less scary for us because we can read in the notes reflections of things that we feel are off or that we receive as attacks. And there are scholars that say, oh, but look what's going on behind this text. So it's super, super helpful. And if you ever thought, any academics and future academics here, if you ever worried that your work is going to go nowhere except in the basement corner stacks of the dusty library, think again. It's really important work.
Well, we started late. We've gone a little late, but I think it's a worthwhile task. If we want to continue the discussion, we do have refreshments just outside the door and to the right. If you'd like to stay for a little while, if you have some time, we'd welcome you. I'm really thankful for these two presentations. They're really powerful, and they're really compelling, and they're really helpful. And I think we all have a lot to take away, and I want to thank you both, Matt and Laura, for coming and being a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.